She came back to sell the ruins, but a storm, a kiln, and one stubborn fisherman forced her to fight for the place she once abandoned. Emma Carter arrived at the coastal town just before noon, the engine of her Audi humming a discordant, high-tech note against the low roar of the Atlantic. She drove slowly, the tires crunching over asphalt that had been reclaimed by the dunes, narrowing the road to a single, precarious lane. To her left, the salt marsh was a graveyard of gray, weathered cedar posts. To her right, the ocean appeared in fragments through a mist so thick it felt like wet wool against the windshield. She had not been here in 14 years, and the silence of the town was a physical weight. Every landmark was a ghost. She passed the boarded-up bait shop where she'd bought blackcurrant licorice as a child, its windows now shattered and staring like hollow eye sockets. The houses leaned toward the north, their shingles scoured raw by a century of gales, looking less like dwellings and more like ancient, tired beasts bracing for one final hit. The harbor didn't just smell of salt. It was a pungent, rotting symphony of fermenting kelp, diesel fumes from a lone trawler, and the heavy, sodden scent of wet hemp rope. It was the smell of her father's hands, a scent she had spent a decade and a half trying to scrub off her own skin in the pressurized, marble-tiled showers of her Boston penthouse. Back there, in the city of glass and high-frequency trading, she was a director of logistics, a master of moving abstract numbers across a screen. Here, she was just the girl who had run away from the mud. She parked at the dead end of a gravel lane, the silence rushing in to fill the space where the engine had been. For 5 minutes, she didn't move. She watched a single seagull struggle against a crosswind, its cry lost in the white noise of the surf. She wasn't just arriving at a location. She was docking at a trauma she had spent her entire adult life navigating around. The building didn't just stand. It clung to the coast like a barnacle on a rusted hull. It was a cedar-shingled ghost perched on the precarious edge of the eroding salt marsh, exactly where her father had raised it, plank by weary plank, in the years after the Great War had ended and the world was trying to find its shape again. The salt air, a relentless, invisible chemist, had silvered the wood until the workshop looked like the calcified scales of a beached leviathan, drying out under an indifferent sun. The sign above the door hung at a tragic angle. One iron chain snapped and rusted into a permanent, agonizing tilt. The carved letters, Carter Clay Studio, were choked with emerald moss and half-hidden by a long, jagged shadow that seemed to stretch from the past itself, a dark finger pointing at her arrival. Emma stepped closer, the soles of her city boots crunching on the sun-bleached shells of dead crabs and shifting gravel. The windows were no longer portals for light. They were opaque, blinded by decades of dried sea spray, salt crystals, and fine grit that effectively shielded the ghosts of the kiln from the prying eyes of the living. The roof sagged at the edges, the ridgepole dipping like a tired, broken spine under the invisible weight of 14 unforgiving winters. The key felt heavy and unnaturally cold in her pocket, a jagged piece of iron that had waited 14 years to bite into the lock again. It was the only thing she had kept from this place, a secret weight at the bottom of her jewelry box, hidden beneath gold watches and pearls. As she approached the door, her hand trembled. The lock didn't give way easily. It fought her, the internal tumblers choked with salt grit and decades of oxidation. She had to lean her shoulder against the silvered wood, pushing until the frame groaned in protest. When it finally yielded with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent marsh, Emma felt the vibration in her own teeth. Inside, the shadows didn't retreat. They gathered in the corners, watching her with the patient indifference of things that have been long forgotten. She walked to the center of the room, her footsteps echoing with a hollow, wooden thud that felt too loud, too intrusive. She stopped at the massive wooden work table and saw a small, dried-out sponge sitting in a rusted tin basin. It was a mundane, pathetic object, but it hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She remembered her father holding that exact sponge, his knuckles swollen from arthritis, his skin mapped with deep cracks of ingrained cobalt and iron oxide. The clay remembers, Em. He had whispered to her one winter night, the kiln glowing like a trapped star behind them. If you're angry, the pot will be brittle. If you're distracted, the walls will slump. You can't lie to the earth. Now, looking at the silent, dust-choked room, Emma realized she had been lying to herself for 14 years. She had built a life of glass and steel because she was terrified of the brutal honesty of the clay. She reached out to touch the rim of a half-finished pitcher sitting on the table, but pulled back at the last second. The dust was so thick it had formed a delicate, gray bridge between the pitcher and the scarred wood. A ghostly umbilical cord she wasn't ready to sever. The air that rushed out to meet her was the heavy, stagnant breath of a tomb that had been sealed while the inhabitants were still mid-sentence. It was a thick, cloying mixture of cold wood ash, the sharp metallic tang of oxidized iron tools, and the sour, mineral scent of ancient, dried-out clay that had long ago lost its plastic soul. Emma stood on the threshold, her lungs burning as they tried to process the oxygen of a different decade. Every breath felt like swallowing a mouthful of history, dry and abrasive. As she stepped deeper into the gloom, the interior of the studio revealed itself as a cathedral of dust and calcified dreams. High above, a single beam of light pierced through a crack in the salt-encrusted skylight, illuminating millions of dust motes that danced in a frantic, silent ballet. To Emma, these weren't just specks of dirt. They were the particulate remains of her father's life, dried skin, fragments of wool, and the microscopic shards of 1,000 fired pots that had turned back into dust. She walked toward the heavy timber shelves that lined the walls like the ribs of a sunken ship. Each shelf was a graveyard of intent. There were bowls with deep, fossilized thumbprints still clearly visible in the dry clay. The final marks left by a man whose hands had shaken before his heart finally failed him. Emma closed her eyes for a second and could almost see the ghost of her 7-year-old self sitting on the floor, covered in wet slip, watching him. "Focus on the center, Em," he would say, his voice a low rumble that competed with the roar of the surf. "The world will try to pull you off balance, but the clay only cares about the center." She opened her eyes, and the ghost was gone, replaced by the suffocating gray silence of the present. She reached out, her hand trembling, and finally touched the rim of a half-finished pitcher. The dust felt like cold velvet, a shroud protecting the fragility of what remained. Some pieces were webbed with fine, cruel cracks, victims of the brutal coastal winters that had seeped through the uninsulated walls. The porcelain had shivered in the dark until it simply gave up and shattered. Others remained eerie in their perfection, coated in a thick, velvety layer of gray silt that Emma was terrified to touch, fearing that the dust was the only skin left on the bones of her father's legacy. In the very center of the room, the massive wooden work table stood like an altar of sacrifice. Tools, wire cutters, wooden ribs, and metal scrapers lay scattered across its scarred, clay-stained surface in a chaotic frozen tableau. Beside it sat the wheel. The heavy iron flywheel was motionless, its pedal crusted with dried slurry that had turned to stone. Emma ran a single, trembling finger across the rim, leaving a vivid, dark trail in the grime. For a split second, the silence broke. She could almost hear the low, rhythmic hum of the motor and the wet, rhythmic slapping sound of wet clay being sintered by powerful palms. She turned away, the pressure of the room pushing against her eardrums like she was diving into deep, cold water. She moved toward the back door, the floorboards complaining with every step of her city boots. When she forced the door open, the Atlantic didn't just greet her, it invaded the space. The wind, smelling of rotting kelp, ozone, and cold salt, pushed her back into the room with physical force. The small wooden dock outside was a disaster of warped cedar and rusted spikes, a skeleton of a pier. Some planks had been torn away entirely by the winter gales, leaving jagged gaps that revealed the churning gray stomach of the harbor below. It was a structure that had given up the fight, a mirror to the man who had built it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the envelope, the paper stiff and clinical against her skin. The return address, Town Clerk, Harbor Division, stared at her with bureaucratic indifference. It contained exactly 4 sentences, but they read like a death warrant for the property. The first was a cold confirmation of her father's passing, devoid of any mention of the artisan he had been. The second detailed the inheritance of what they called a substandard maritime structure. The third was the real blade, a ledger of 3 years of unpaid land taxes, interest penalties, and emergency repair liens that totaled more than she had earned in her last 2 years of corporate grinding. The fourth sentence was a polite, terrifying suggestion to resolve the matter immediately or face the indignity of a public auction. Emma traced the embossed seal of the town clerk, her thumb catching on the raised paper until the skin went white. The math was cold, clinical, and utterly devastating. The unpaid land taxes, compounded by 14 years of interest and the municipal emergency repair liens, formed a mountain of debt that loomed larger than the coastal cliffs. The plan was a desperate, surgical necessity. Sell the kilns to a salvage crew, scrap the heavy iron wheel for parts, and sign over the deed to the first developer with a checkbook large enough to clear her name. She needed to be back in the city, back in her sterile, glass-walled office where the only thing that decayed was a digital file, not a family legacy, before the first hard frost of autumn could lock her into this rotting life. She wanted a transaction that left no scars, a clean excision of her past that would allow her to finally stop looking over her shoulder. But as she stood in the center of the silent workshop, the plan began to dissolve in the humid, salt-heavy air. She realized that she couldn't simply close the chapter. The building wasn't just an asset on a ledger. It was an extension of her father's physical body. The roof ridgepole, sagging like a broken spine, mirrored the way he had looked in his final years, stooped, tired, but refusing to buckle. Every time she looked at the sagging timber, she felt a phantom weight on her own shoulders, a crushing responsibility to a man she had spent a decade and a half trying to forget. Before she could even think about the outside world, she had to face the ruins within. The inventory felt like a funeral rite, a slow walk through a graveyard of missed opportunities. Emma moved along the back shelves, her breath hitching as she lifted a heavy, dust-caked plate. It was fired in a mistake blue, a deep, cobalt glaze that had bubbled and run in the kiln, creating a pattern that looked like moonlight hitting the surface of a midnight sea. She remembered him laughing about it, saying the fire had a mind of its own. Now, the plate was webbed with fine, cruel cracks, its beauty compromised by years of neglect. She cataloged the failures with a growing sense of dread. The kilns were choked with cold ash and the remains of shattered stilts. The raw clay blocks in the corner had turned to stone, as solid and unyielding as the granite foundation of the pier. She struck one with the heel of her boot. It didn't even dent. It was fossilized time, a physical manifestation of 14 years of silence. To sell this ruin now, in its state of decay, was to accept a pittance from men like Daniel Whitmore, to let them buy her history for the price of the dirt it sat on. To restore it, even slightly, was the only way to reclaim the value of her own name. But the cost of restoration was measured in more than just money. It was measured in the very sweat and marrow she had tried to protect in the city. This simple plan was the first casualty of the workshop's suffocating reality. It died the moment she realized that the debt wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the air she was breathing. "I don't run a ferry service for city tourists looking to play at being locals," Mark said, his voice as sharp as the gutting knife in his hand. He didn't look up from the net he was mending. His fingers moved with a jagged, angry precision, weaving the nylon mesh like he was capturing a grudge. "And I certainly don't assist in the dismantling of this harbor's history for a quick exit. I saw your car, Emma. It doesn't belong on a gravel road, and you don't belong in a room that smells like wet earth." Emma didn't flinch. She stepped closer, the smell of brine and old wood filling her lungs, forcing her to stand her ground. "I'm not looking for an assistant, Mr. Dalton. I'm looking for a navigator who knows which sandbars shift after a gale and which pilings can actually hold a loaded skiff. If you're too busy nursing a grudge against the city to recognize a professional contract, tell me now so I can find someone who values the work more than the resentment. Or maybe you're just afraid the harbor has changed too much for you to handle." Mark stopped. The silence stretched between them, punctured only by the rhythmic, agonizing slap of water against the hulls in the marina. He looked at her then, really looked at her, noting the smudge of gray clay on her cheek and the way her expensive boots were already ruined by the salt slush. "The tide won't wait for your pride," Mark muttered, his tone shifting from flat rejection to a wary, defensive curiosity. "The inlet is choked with silt from the spring runoff. You try to haul a ton of kiln-fired stone through there without a flat-bottom draft, and you'll be diving for your legacy in 20 feet of salt water before you even clear the harbor lights. Your father knew that. He knew the water was a beast you don't negotiate with. "I know whose daughter I am," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the roar of the Atlantic. "And I'm not here to play local. I'm here to settle a debt that's 14 years overdue. If you won't help, stay out of my way." She spent the next 2 days in a fever of preparation. Her hands, once soft from office work, began to blister and bleed. She cleared the debris from the dock. Each rusted nail she pulled feeling like a splinter removed from her own mind. She mapped out the structural failures with a piece of chalk, marking the wood like a surgeon marking a patient for a terminal operation. On the third morning, Mark returned. He didn't come empty-handed. His skiff was loaded with heavy, pressure-treated timber and a portable generator that hummed with a low, aggressive growl. He didn't ask for permission. He simply tied his boat to the strongest piling and began offloading the gear with a rhythmic, mechanical fury. "I'm not doing this for you," he barked as Emma ran down the dock to meet him. "I'm doing this because in the winter of '08, your father spent 3 nights in a freezing shed fixing my father's rudder while the fleet was grounded. He wouldn't take a dime. He said a harbor only works if the people in it don't let each other sink. He told me then that the clay and the sea are the same. They both take everything you give and offer no guarantees. Consider the debt transferred from his hands to mine. Now grab the other end of this beam and try not to fall in. If you break an arm, I'm not stopping the work to haul you to the clinic." They worked through the evening of the 4th day, the sky bleeding into a dark, bruised violet that seemed to settle directly onto the churning surface of the harbor. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air was so heavy with moisture that their clothes felt damp and heavy against their skin. Mark showed her how to use a heavy-duty industrial drill, the torque nearly snapping her wrists until she learned to lean her entire body weight into the tool, anchoring herself against the vibrating timber. "Rusted spikes are for people who want to rebuild every 3 years," Mark shouted over the rising whistle of the wind, gesturing to the bucket of old, bleeding iron nails they had pried out of the rotting cedar. "If you want this dock to survive a real northeaster, you don't just nail it, you bolt it. You bolt the history to the bedrock, not just the wood." Emma spent 4 hours on her knees, her hands shaking from exhaustion as she guided the thick, galvanized steel bolts into the pressure-treated timber. Every turn of the wrench was a deliberate, physical act of defiance against Whitmore's condemned notice. She watched the metal bite deep into the wood, squeezing out beads of fresh sap that smelled of pine and resin, a sharp contrast to the rotting scent of the marsh. By the time they finished, her Audi, parked at the top of the lane, was coated in a layer of fine salt grit and dust, its sleek, polished surface looking increasingly ridiculous and fragile, like a tuxedo at a funeral. She didn't care about the paint job anymore. For the first time in a decade, the ache in her shoulders felt more real than any quarterly logistics report she had ever filed in her Boston office. They weren't just fixing a pier, they were creating a skeleton that could actually fight back. And so the real work began. They became a synchronized unit of sweat and salt, driven by the urgency of a shifting barometer and a shared history that neither was ready to talk about. The inventory felt like a funeral rite. Emma moved along the shelves, her breath hitching as she lifted each piece. Some were ghosts of her childhood, a mug with a slightly too thick handle she remembered her father laughing about, a bowl glazed in a mistake blue that had become a local favorite. Many were ruined, the fine porcelain spider-webbed with cracks from a decade of thermal shock. But as she reached the bottom shelf, she found the raw materials. Emma knelt before the wall of fossilized clay, her expensive city coat dragging in the thick, gray silt of the floorboards. A sudden, irrational fury surged through her, a visceral rejection of the stillness that had held this room captive for 14 years. She didn't just want to clean, she wanted to break the silence. She found an old, iron-headed mallet in the tool drawer, its handle smooth from decades of her father's grip, and began to strike the clay blocks. The sound was a rhythmic, violent thud that echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a heartbeat returning to a dead chest. She shattered the stone-hard earth into jagged shards, the gray dust coating her throat and eyelashes until she looked like a terracotta statue herself, a creature emerging from the very material she was trying to conquer. Then came the slaking. She submerged these sharp, parched fragments into buckets of gathered rainwater, watching as thousands of tiny bubbles hissed to the surface. It was the sound of a profound thirst, The clay drank the water with the desperation of the dying. Over the next 2 days, she transformed this mass into a thick, viscous slurry, which she then spread onto heavy plaster bats to draw out the excess moisture. It was grueling, filthy work that demanded the strength of every muscle in her back and forearms. When the clay finally became plastic enough, the wedging began, the brutal process of kneading. Emma leaned into the mass with the full weight of her body, pushing out air bubbles with rhythmic, ram's head motions that left her shoulders screaming in a way she had never experienced in her sterile city office. When she finally sat at the potter's wheel, the moment of truth arrived with the first press of the pedal. The motor coughed, spitting a spark of blue light before settling into a low, aggressive hum that vibrated through her very spine. Her first attempt was a total disaster. The clay tore itself from her wet palms and turned into a shapeless, mocking slump that sprayed gray mud across her face. It was a slap from the past, a reminder that the earth does not forgive weakness. But the second attempt, a wide, heavy-bottomed bowl, began to find its center. Under her slippery palms, the walls rose with agonizing slowness, millimeter by millimeter. The friction of skin against wet grit filled the room with the humid, primal scent of raw earth. In that moment, the studio ceased to be a museum or a tomb. It became a living factory where raw matter was being forged into sheer will. By the evening of the 5th day, the pier reinforced by Mark and the shelves filled with new, damp vessels created a new geometry of power in the harbor. The workshop no longer looked abandoned. It looked like a fortress bracing for an inevitable siege. The kiln glowed softly through the workshop window that night, a steady orange light pulsing inside the chamber as the temperature climbed toward its peak. The heat spread slowly through the room, carrying the familiar, primal scent of baking clay and warm stone. Emma sat at the wooden table with her father's notebook open beside her, the yellowed pages fluttering in the heat wash. She had not planned to read it again, but the quiet evening made the handwritten lines impossible to ignore. The handwriting remained precise, even after decades of use in a damp environment. Measurements for cobalt glazes, specific ratios for iron oxide, small notes about the precise timing of the cooling cycle. But it was the remarks in the margins that held her captive. She stopped at one line near the bottom of a page, written in a hand that looked tired. Clay remembers patience. Rushing ruins the shape. If the fire is too fast, the heart of the piece shatters before the skin can harden. She closed the notebook gently, feeling the ghost of his wisdom settling into her own bones. The kiln continued its slow, rhythmic work behind her, a low roar that sounded like a living beast breathing in the dark. The firing would take several more hours, leaving her with nothing to do but wait and listen to the rising wind. She stepped outside onto the newly reinforced pier. The harbor lay mostly dark now, with only a few scattered lights reflecting across the surface of the water like drowned stars. Mark's boat rocked quietly near the dock, a small lamp glowing in the cabin window. He was still awake, likely watching the barometer. The wind had calmed into a deceptive, eerie stillness, leaving the water as smooth and black as polished obsidian. Emma walked to the very end of the pier and leaned against the railing. The structure felt solid beneath her weight, a testament to their shared sweat and the heavy timber they had fought into place. She heard the rhythmic thud of footsteps on the dock behind her long before he spoke. Mark approached, carrying 2 chipped ceramic mugs that had clearly seen better days. "Coffee," he said, his voice unusually soft in the night air. "Black and hot enough to melt a fishing hook." "Thanks," she replied, taking the mug. The warmth seeped into her stiff fingers. They stood side by side, watching the faint, rhythmic movement of the tide. "Kiln still running?" he asked, nodding toward the workshop window. "Another 2 hours of peak heat," she said. "Then the slow descent. It's a delicate balance. First real firing since your father died?" "Probably longer," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The last few years, he was mostly firing memories. The shelves were full, but the fire was gone. Mark nodded, his gaze following hers. The harbor used to smell like clay and smoke when he worked late. It was a comfort to the night shift on the boats. It meant someone was awake, watching the shore. They drank in silence for a long moment. The distant sound of waves breaking against the outer rocks drifted across the bay, a low, guttural warning. Mark rested his calloused arms on the railing, his face illuminated by the faint orange glow from the studio. "Whitmore stopped by my boat earlier," he said, the tension returning to his voice. "He's not a man who likes to be ignored, Emma." Emma stiffened, the warmth of the coffee suddenly gone. "What did he want this time?" "To remind me that my fishing license renewal goes through a board he happens to chair. He called it a friendly check-in." "That sounds like a threat." "It was. He's putting the squeeze on everyone who touched this pier. He thinks if he cuts off your support, you'll fold before the storm even hits." Emma exhaled slowly, her breath a ghost in the cold air. "Because he thinks helping me delays his porcelain marina. He wants to pave over the mud because mud isn't profitable." She stared out across the dark water, realizing that the debt she was settling wasn't just to her father, but to every person in this harbor who still had dirt under their fingernails. "He doesn't just want the shoreline cleared. He wants it sanitized," Mark said, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the new planks. "He's been buying up the old canning factory and the bait shop through shell companies for months. Your workshop is the last jagged tooth in a mouth he wants to fill with porcelain." Emma looked at the kiln's glow, then back at the dark, encroaching silhouette of the town's newer developments. "He offered enough to pay the taxes 10 times over. He called it a transition fee." Mark spat into the water, a sharp, cynical sound. "It's a burial fee. He wants to pave over the mud where your father stood for 40 years. If you sign that paper, the public access to the South Harbor dies with this building. The fishermen will have to sail 3 miles north just to offload a haul, because they won't be able to afford the docking fees at his marina." He turned to her, his eyes catching the orange flicker from the workshop window. "You're not just deciding on a sale, Emma. You're deciding if this harbor still has a pulse, or if it's just a playground for people who like the view but hate the smell of fish." The low-frequency hum of a heavy, expensive engine broke the morning fog long before the black sedan even appeared on the gravel lane. The car moved with a predatory slowness, its tires barely making a sound on the silt-covered road. When it finally stopped at the edge of the marsh, the doors opened with a heavy, pressurized thud that sounded like a gavel hitting a bench in a high-security courtroom. A man in a crisp, neon-reflective vest, carrying a digital tablet like a tactical weapon, stepped out beside Daniel Whitmore. The inspector didn't look at the ocean or the historic curve of the building. He kept his eyes on the screen, tapping through satellite overlays and property boundaries with a practiced, bureaucratic indifference. "Cease and desist," the inspector said, his voice as flat and rehearsed as a recording. He handed Emma a thick packet of legal notices, the red danger stamps already bleeding into the damp paper under the morning mist. "Unauthorized structural modification of a maritime facility. Under current zoning laws, specifically Section 14B regarding coastal erosion zones, this pier is officially condemned as a catastrophic public hazard. All work stops now, Ms. Carter. If another nail is driven into this wood, if another bag of cement is mixed, the fines will be levied by the hour, compounded by the environmental impact fees." Whitmore stood a few paces back, the wind barely ruffling his perfectly managed hair. He looked at the newly reinforced beams with a calculated, predatory pity. "I warned you, Emma. This coastline doesn't belong to the ghosts of potters anymore. It belongs to the standards of the present, to safety, to insurance, and to growth. Look at this place through the eyes of an investor, not a daughter. It's a liability waiting for a lawsuit." He stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was almost intimate, the smell of expensive cologne clashing with the salt air. "The fines for unpermitted harbor work are 10 times what this entire studio is worth on its best day. I have the board's approval for the marina project, Emma. They want the tax revenue. They want the tourists who can actually afford the docking fees. Take the buyout check now, before the town council moves for an emergency demolition on Monday. By Tuesday, this will all be a pile of splinters and a mountain of debt you can never outrun in your city life." Emma didn't look at the check. She looked at Mark, who stood on the deck of his boat, his hand white-knuckled on a heavy iron pry bar, a silent statue of defiance. Then she looked at the kiln, where the first real fire in 14 years was beginning to breathe, the heat shimmering against the glass. "Monday is a long way off, Daniel," she said, her voice cutting through the fog like a blade. "And the Atlantic doesn't check the zoning laws before it hits. You're trying to build on sand. I'm standing on the clay." The storm Mark had predicted arrived not with a roar, but with a bone-chilling, sudden drop in pressure that made their eardrums pop like bubbles. By Thursday afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised slate, the clouds hanging so low they seemed to scrape the masts of the grounded fleet. The harbor was a chaotic, white-capped churn, and the wind began to scream through the narrow gaps in the workshop's cedar siding, a high-pitched keening that sounded like a choir of ghosts. Emma didn't leave. She couldn't. The kiln was in the middle of its most volatile phase, the final soak. If the temperature dropped too quickly from a draft, or if the salt-heavy air extinguished the burners, the work of the last week would be reduced to expensive gravel. She fueled the kiln to its absolute maximum, the orange light roaring in the belly of the studio. It was a defiant, artificial sun held captive against the gray gale outside. Every time a massive gust hit the building, the floorboards vibrated, and the scent of superheated clay filled the air, thick and primal. In the deafening roar of the gale, Emma realized the studio was breathing with the storm. The walls flexed inward with every massive gust, and fine gray dust from the rafters rained down like dry snow. She grabbed a heavy, old wool blanket, soaked it in a bucket of gathered rainwater until it was nearly too heavy to lift, and began to wedge it into a widening gap near the kiln's vent where the wind was threatening to blow out the pilot lights. The steam exploded around her in a blinding white veil as the cold water hit the radiant heat of the 2,000-degree furnace. It hissed like 1,000 snakes, the hot vapor stinging her face and dampening her hair. She stood there, her boots braced against the vibrating floorboards, using her shoulder to hold the wet barricade in place. Her muscles burned, and the skin of her forearms went flush red from the intense heat, but she didn't move. She was the only thing standing between the fragile porcelain inside and the freezing chaos outside. In that moment, she understood what her father meant about the clay remembering. The pots inside were absorbing the vibration of her struggle, being forged not just by gas and fire, but by the sheer, stubborn will she was pressing into the walls of the studio. When the first massive, green-black wave slammed against the pier, the entire building shuddered to its foundations. Emma ran to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The structure she and Mark had rebuilt groaned, the new galvanized bolts straining and shrieking against the immense, crushing weight of the Atlantic. She could see the white foam surging beneath the floorboards, licking at the joists with icy, salty tongues. Mark appeared through the blinding salt spray, a shadow in yellow oilskins that shone like armor in the gloom. He didn't waste breath on words. He threw a heavy, tarred rope to Emma, signaling her to help him lash the heavy pottery crates and the backup generator directly to the structural load-bearing beams of the workshop. They worked in a frantic, rhythmic desperation, their hands numb from the freezing spray. Emma's boots slipped on the drenched, seaweed-slicked planks, and for a second, the ocean tried to pull her under, but Mark's hand was there, a solid anchor in the chaos. As a second, even larger wave crashed over the dock, the reinforced pilings did something Whitmore hadn't predicted. They didn't shatter into splinters. They flexed. They breathed. They absorbed the blow like a living thing and held their ground. Inside the studio, Emma stood by the kiln, her hands pressed against the warm bricks, shielding the fire with her own body as the wind tried to tear the roof from the walls. The town, watching from the safety of the high cliffs, finally saw it. The light of the kiln burning through the darkest part of the storm. It was a steady, orange eye that refused to blink. It was a signal fire for the entire harbor. By dawn, the wind had died down to a low growl, leaving the shore littered with kelp and debris. Whitmore's black sedan was nowhere to be seen, his legal threats feeling hollow compared to the raw power of the night they had survived. Emma sat on the edge of the dock, her face smeared with soot and salt, watching the first rays of sunlight hit the water. She wasn't the woman who had arrived in the Audi anymore. She was drenched, exhausted, and covered in the dust of her father's legacy. But for the first time in 14 years, she wasn't running. She was anchored. They stood together on the shivering dock, the potter and the fisherman, ready not just to repair a building, but to defend a harbor that had finally found its pulse again. The debt wasn't gone, but it had been transformed into a foundation as solid and unyielding as fired clay.